Okay, let's unpack this. You've shared a really interesting stack of sources with us, these transcripts from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratories Saturday Morning NeuroSim meetings.
Hmm.
And right away, you get the sense these aren't just casual coffee chats, are they? They seem like really dense explorations.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They're diving deep into that fascinating intersection of neuroscience, AI, computation, and how we think about complex living systems in general.
It feels like a really broad scope.
It is. They cover a huge range, really, from like fundamental ideas about computation and biology all the way through to the real practicalities, building models, wrestling with tricky data, and even starting to think about the ethics of future tech in this space.
Okay, so our mission then in this deep dive is to try and cut through all that material, navigate these high-level discussions,
Hmm.
and pull out the most important nuggets, maybe the surprising facts, the key insights, just to give you listening a clearer picture of the cutting-edge ideas being explored.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Where should we start? What's the main thread?
Well, I think the core thread running through pretty much all these notes is this idea of applying computational thinking, principles, models to understand biological systems.
Like seeing life through a computational lens.
Exactly. A perspective that sees life itself through the lens of information processing, of control systems.
And a concept that seemed to pop up quite a bit, go back to cybernetics, was Ashby's good regulator theorem. What's that about, fundamentally?
Yeah, Ashby's theorem. At its heart, it basically states that for any system to effectively regulate or control another system, it needs to have an internal model of that system. And crucially, that model has to be complex enough.
So you need enough internal complexity to handle the complexity you're trying to manage.
Precisely. That's the core idea.
But what really struck me reading the discussions was, okay, it gives us this rule, this foundation, but it doesn't actually tell us how much complexity is enough for, say, a real biological system or an AI.
That's exactly the challenge. It's a fundamental principle, but it doesn't give you the recipe. And maybe even more challenging, how do you design a regulator or an AI that can handle completely unexpected events, things out of distribution, as they say?
Stuff it's never seen before.
Right. Things it couldn't possibly have modeled in advance. That's a massive open problem for AI today, and the theorem really highlights that underlying theoretical hurdle.
Okay. And building on that, when they talk about biological systems, they mention directed networks, feedback loops, lots of feedback
Well,
loops.
that's absolutely packed with them.
And the sources brought up a really interesting point, referencing a blog post called Slime Mold Time Mold, that these feedback loops can actually destroy correlation. What does that mean?
It's a really crucial insight. We always hear that phrase, correlation doesn't imply causality, right?
Standard stuff.
But what's surprising here, because of these really complex feedback dynamics in biological systems, is that no correlation also doesn't imply no causality.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. It means you have to be incredibly careful interpreting relationships, or even the lack of relationships you see in data, especially in biological networks where you've got all these hidden feedback loops potentially messing with any simple correlations you might find.
So just because two things don't seem related doesn't mean one isn't influencing the other through some complex pathway.
Exactly. Makes analysis tricky.
And this idea of information processing, it wasn't just limited to animals or brains. They mentioned plants.
Yeah, that was fascinating. The discussion touched on processing happening in, well, unexpected places like plants. The idea was maybe you could use computational models, perhaps even something relatively simple like a perceptron.
Like one of the earliest artificial neuron types.
Right. Use that as a sort of computational stand-in to help understand how a plant might be processing signals from its environment, light, water, whatever, even without anything like a nervous system.
That's a cool idea. And does that connect to the cellular supremacy concept they mentioned?
It does, yeah. That ability of seemingly simple biological entities to compute leads right into this idea of cellular supremacy. This is the notion that living matter itself, things like bacteria or slime molds even, could potentially be harnessed as cellular computers.
Computers made of living stuff?
Kind of. The idea is they might actually outperform our classical silicon computers, but only at very specific, narrow tasks.
Okay, so you're not talking about replacing my laptop with bacteria anytime soon.
Huh, no, not quite. It's more about implementing highly specific functions, like, say, executing Boolean logic gates, or maybe running certain distributed algorithms using these living systems. They also mentioned DNA computing as a related field, which has been explored for a while now using the DNA molecules themselves.
Fascinating. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, another major theme that came through was embodiment, the importance of the physical form and interaction.
Absolutely. A huge theme. How crucial physical form and interaction are for understanding intelligence, whether it's, biological or artificial.
And the core concept there seemed to be the sensory motor loop.
Right. It's inherently a closed loop system. We're constantly acting in the world and simultaneously receiving feedback from the world. It's a continuous cycle.
Like walking or riding a bike. You're always adjusting.
Exactly like that. You're making constant, tiny adjustments based on the feedback you're getting.
And the sources pointed out that if you break that loop or introduce delays, like in some simulations or maybe clunky VR, it really messes things up.
It does. It severely hinders our ability to interact cleanly, to learn effectively, or to control things smoothly. That tight feedback loop is critical.
Which connects directly to the discussions they had around VR, AR, XR, virtual and augmented reality.
There was definite excitement there about the potential. They even suggested it could become a, quote, multi-million-dollar industry, specifically for things like curriculum integration.
Letting students experience concepts in a really embodied way.
Yeah, imagine learning physics or biology by actually interacting with virtual models in 3D space. Standard VR gives you the visuals and the sound pretty well. Head-mounted displays, accelerometers track your movement, loudspeakers for audio.
But the sense of touch.
Yeah.
Haptics.
Yeah.
That's lagging behind.
That's what the sources highlighted, yeah.
Yeah.
Haptics are often underexplored in current consumer technology. It's hard to do well.
But people are working on it.
Oh, definitely. They pointed to some really cutting-edge research, like the John Rogers group at UIUC. They're working on these amazing flexible electronics that can basically laminate right onto your skin.
Wow. To give you touch feedback.
Exactly. Sophisticated touch feedback. They even mentioned a company called Psionic, which was apparently on Shark Tank, as an example of haptics being developed for prosthetics, giving users much more sort of human-like sensory feedback from their artificial limbs.
That's incredible. And VR isn't just about simulating our reality, right? They've talked about non-Euclidean spaces.
Yeah, that's where it gets really mind-bending. Stepping into VR opens up possibilities beyond just copying the physical world. They discussed exploring and navigating non-Euclidean spaces, geometries that kind of defy our everyday intuition, like hyperbolic space.
It's like those Escher drawings.
Sort of like that, yeah, or even creating non-Euclidean game worlds. It lets you experience reality in fundamentally different ways, which could be really interesting for learning or even just exploration.
Okay, so how does this embodiment idea connect back to AI?
Well, they talked quite a bit about embodied intelligence in AI, and also intelligence inspired by how biological forms actually develop. They termed it morphogenetic-inspired intelligence.
Morphogenetic, like morphogenesis, the development of shape.
Exactly. And they reference specific work on things like developmental Breitenberg vehicles, which are simple robots whose behavior emerges from their sensor-motor connections, and also neural cellular automata, or NCAs.
NCAs, what are those?
They're a really cool concept. Imagine a grid of cells, right? And each cell has a very simple neural network component inside it.
Yeah.
Then you use something like evolutionary algorithms to find rules for these little neural nets, rules that cause the whole grid of cells interacting locally to collectively self-assemble into a specific shape over time.
So starting from maybe one seed cell.
Right. It could grow into, say, a specific pattern, like the sources mentioned, maybe a cartoon rabbit shape appearing on the grid. It's AI inspired directly by how biological systems develop and organize themselves.
That's wild. And what about when you have multiple agents, multiple AIs interacting?
Yeah, that's another layer of complexity. When you scale up to multi-agent systems, could be robots collaborating or AI programs, the challenge isn't just having each one follow its own plan. They need to coordinate, adapt to each other.
How did they do that?
The sources discuss probabilistic approaches, things like Bayesian delegation or inverse planning. This involves one agent trying to essentially guess or infer the hidden goals or internal states of the other agents it's interacting with.
Like trying to read their minds computationally.
Sort of, yeah. And they noted this connects back to some classic computational ideas like hidden Markov models or the Viterbi algorithm tools used for inferring hidden states from sequences of observations. It shows how these really advanced multi-agent problems are still touching upon established computational foundations.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Let's maybe pivot now towards the brain itself. What specific insights about the brain and cognition came out of these NeuroSim meetings?
Sure. One concept that came up repeatedly was the enneagram.
The memory trace.
Yeah, often posited as potentially the basic physical unit of memory in the brain, where a specific memory lives.
But the question is, how does it live there? How is the information stored?
That's the fundamental question researchers are grappling with. Is it best described using concepts from information theory, like, Shannon information, bits and bytes? Or is it more about the physical changes strengthening or weakening synaptic connections, the weights between neurons, more like how artificial neural networks store information?
Still an open question then.
Very much so. And researchers are using some really powerful tools to try and poke at this, like optogenetics.
Right, using light to control neurons.
Exactly. You genetically modify specific neurons so you can activate or silence them just by shining light of a certain color on them. They're using this to manipulate suspected enneagram cells in specific brain regions, places like the dentate gyrus and the hippocampus, or the amygdala during memory tasks like associative learning.
Trying to see if activating those cells brings back the memory or silencing them prevents it.
Precisely, to see exactly how those specific cells are involved in storing and retrieving the memory.
Okay. And did they talk about intelligence itself? How to define
They
it?
did. And it seems, maybe unsurprisingly, that when you ask people for a definition, you get a whole bunch of different answers, often quite utilitarian answers focused on, task performance or achieving goals.
So no single definition everyone agrees on.
Not really. And it highlighted the importance of being clear when we talk about intelligence. Are we talking about natural biological intelligence or artificial intelligence? They might be quite different things.
Makes sense. What else stood out about brain function?
Another really fascinating area they explored was research on traveling waves in the brain.
Waves of electrical activity.
Yeah, dynamic patterns of neural activity that seem to propagate across the brain surface. They're observed across different brain areas, even across different species, and they've been linked to various functions: memory consolidation, navigation, even motor control.
So they're pretty widespread.
They seem to be. But what was particularly striking was a finding mentioned in the sources, apparently quite surprising. Some studies show these waves forming consistent spiral patterns.
Spirals. Like a whirlpool.
Kind of, yeah. And these spirals seem to be predominantly centered on one particular brain area, the somatosensory cortex.
The part that processes touch and body sense.
Yeah.
Why there?
That's the big question. And even weirder, or maybe more suggestive, the local wiring, the axonal architecture within that somatosensory area, apparently shows a matching circular structure.
Wow. So the wiring seems built for spirals centered on the touch area.
It raises all sorts of questions, right? Why that specific hub? What are these global wave patterns doing? Still lots to figure out.
Definitely. What about larger scale brain organization? They mentioned neural gradient.
Yes, neural gradients. These are large-scale organizational principles. Think of them as gradual variations in structure or function across different brain regions. Not sharp boundaries, but smooth transitions.
And these are set up early on.
Apparently established quite early in life, and then they get refined through development, especially during what they call sensitive periods times, when the brain is particularly plastic.
How do they even measure these gradients?
It involves some pretty complex analysis. You start with connectivity matrices, maps of how different brain areas are wired together, structurally or functionally. Then they use mathematical techniques, like simulating random walks on that network, or using eigenvector decomposition.
Okay. Getting technical now.
Yeah, it's basically a way to find the main axes of variation, the principal components, across the brain's connectivity pattern. That reveals these large-scale gradients.
And this is useful for?
Well, this whole approach is now being applied to analyze large data sets, especially to understand neurodevelopmental conditions, trying to see if the gradients develop differently.
I see. And speaking of complexity in data, they also talked about just classifying brain cells. That sounds basic, but apparently it's not.
Not at all. It's a fundamental challenge. How do you divide brain cells into distinct cell types? The answer you get really depends on the criteria you use.
Like what they look like versus what genes they're using.
Exactly. Are you looking at their physical shape and electrical properties, their phenotype? Or are you looking at their molecular signature, like which genes are turned on or off their transcriptomics? You get different answers.
So how many types are there?
That's the million-dollar question. You have data sets like the one from the Allen Institute, based on transcriptomics, identifying maybe 3,000 different subclusters of cells. Then you have things like the big brain data set, which is incredibly high-resolution imaging, histology, staining, giving a different kind of view.
And it's hard to connect these different views.
Very hard. Reconciling these data sets and agreeing on a definitive classification of cell types is still considered a big open question in neuroscience.
Huh. It seems so basic, but it's really complex.
It is. And they even brought up an interesting idea using model cards.
Model cards, like for machine learning.
Exactly. They were originally developed to document and explain AI models, what data they were trained on, their limitations, etc. The suggestion was maybe we need something similar for these complex biological data models to help people understand what they represent and how to use them responsibly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Did they touch on any other specific brain topics like neuroimaging?
Briefly, yeah, they mentioned neuroimaging studies involving psychedelics.
Oh, interesting. What was the take?
Well, the point wasn't just that, you can easily find statistical differences in brain scans after someone takes psilocybin, like seeing increased connectivity between certain areas, which gets reported a lot.
Right. You see those headlines.
Yeah, the emphasis in the discussion was more on the computational models being used to analyze that imaging data. Are those models explainable? Can they actually tell us something about the underlying physiological mechanisms or the brain dynamics that are changing?
Rather than just saying connectivity increased.
Exactly, especially because, as they noted, figuring out psychiatric dosing for various conditions is often still a bit of a trial and error process. Better, more explanatory models of brain effects could potentially help with that down the line.
Right. Which kind of brings us back full circle, doesn't it, to AI, machine learning, and how it interacts with biology.
It really does. There's this constant back and forth.
So ML is being used on biological data, right?
Extensively. Think about using, say, convolutional neural networks, CNNs, the kind often used for images to process complex microscopy images. Maybe automatically identifying subtle developmental features in a tiny worm, like C. elegans from thousands of pictures.
Or sequence data.
Or using recurrent neural networks, RNNs, which are good with sequences to analyze biological sequences like DNA, RNA, or protein structures. Lots of applications there.
But it's not just using AI as a tool for biology. AI models are also being inspired by biology.
Yes, definitely. That was another strong thing. They mentioned vision transformers, VITs. That's a type of powerful deep learning model used a lot for image tasks now. And researchers are training them in ways that explicitly mimic biological visual development. There was this one really cool example. Training a VIT using only video recorded from the first-person perspective of newborn chicks.
Through the eyes of a chick, seriously.
Yeah. As the chicks explored their little environment right after hatching, the idea was to see if the AI model, learning from this biologically relevant input stream, could solve a key problem that biological visual systems are great at: view invariant object recognition.
Being able to recognize an object no matter how you look at it, from different angles.
Exactly, which is something we do effortlessly, but it's tricky for AI. So using biology as a direct teaching signal for the AI.
That's clever. What about large language models, LLMs? Are they relevant here beyond just processing text?
Apparently so. They're being explored for analyzing genomic data too, tasks like predicting gene functions or protein sequences. And there's even this more speculative idea of treating complex brain signals like EEG recordings over time.
Treating brainwaves as a language.
Kind of. Treating them as sequences that an LLM could potentially process, maybe to predict upcoming brain states or understand the grammar of brain activity. They even floated a concept name, a brain transformer model.
Oh, okay. And this ties into making AI understandable, right? Interpretability.
Hugely important topic. The sources referenced a specific recent report from Anthropic AI, one of the big AI labs.
What did they find?
They reportedly managed to identify millions of concepts, distinct ideas or features being represented inside their large language model, Claude. Things the model learned on its own.
Millions. Inside the AI.
That's what the report claimed. And it was framed as possibly the first ever detailed look inside the workings of a production-scale commercial LLM.
Why is that so significant?
Well, understanding how these incredibly complex, often black box models actually process information and arrive at their outputs, it's seen as absolutely crucial. Not just for, scientific curiosity, but for improving things like AI safety and reliability. If you know how it works, maybe you can prevent it from doing harmful things.
Trying to map the inside of the machine.
Essentially, yes, building a map of that internal landscape.
And looking further ahead, they talked about AGI, artificial general intelligence.
They did touch upon it. And a really interesting point was raised, challenging the common assumption that AGI, if it arrives, might just appear fully formed, ready to go.
Like flipping a switch.
Right. The suggestion was, maybe that's flawed thinking. Perhaps we need to be building AI systems that incorporate continual learning, the ability to keep learning and adapting after deployment. Or even systems that go through developmental stages, maybe drawing parallels to how human children develop cognitive abilities, like Piaget's stages.
So AI that grows up, in a sense.
In a sense, yeah,
Yeah.
needs to develop, not just be switched on.
Okay. So besides the core science in AI, the discussions also covered the practice of doing this kind of research. The community, the data, the ethics.
Yeah, they definitely touched on the practical realities.
How did the community aspect come up?
Well, just by listing all the different projects and meetings connected to the Orthogonal lab, things like DA Worm, Cognition Futures, the Cybernetics Reading Group, Neurospatial AI, open source meetings, Joe Pro, Open Worm, the INCF affiliation. It paints a picture of a very collaborative ecosystem.
Research doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Exactly. And they specifically highlighted initiatives like Google Summer of Code, GSOC, and their own open source meetings as ways to bring in students and early career researchers.
Giving them experience.
More than just technical experience, too. The goal mentioned was providing tangible professional development skills, getting mentoring, learning to write documentation or blog posts, improving communication, navigating career options, building a network, stuff beyond just coding.
That sounds really valuable. What about the data itself? Neuroscience data. Is it easy to work with?
Apparently not always. The sources were pretty candid. They said neuroscience datasets can often be, quote, a mess for outsiders.
Messy how?
Just diverse formats, lack of standardization, missing metadata. It can require a significant investment of money and time just to build the tools needed to parse the data, integrate different data sets, and make them usable for new analyses.
Which brings us back to those model cards again.
Exactly. That idea came up again, maybe using something like model cards, but adapted for data could help make these complex neuroscience data sets more understandable and accessible.
Okay. And ethics. That must come up with AI and neuroscience combined.
It did, particularly concerning these closed-loop neurostimulation AI systems AI that's directly reading from and writing back to the brain in real time.
Yeah, that raises some flags.
For sure. The discussion emphasized the importance of not just vaguely acknowledging ethical concerns, but actually identifying and addressing specific issues. They mentioned using frameworks like considering 4 themes of ethical dilemmas as a structured way to start unpacking the complexities.
So needing a structured approach, not just hand-waving.
Right. And related to that, the sources also noted how difficult it can be to find a single, truly cohesive approach when you're trying to bridge fields as different as, say, theoretical computer science, wet lab biology, cognitive neuroscience, and cutting-edge AI.
Too many different languages and perspectives.
Perhaps. It suggests there's not only room for lots of different viewpoints, but also a real need to actively think about what might be missing, what crucial connections or perspectives aren't being adequately addressed in current research.
Okay, so quite a journey through these discussions. If we try to synthesize, what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Well, we've taken this deep dive into the NeuroSim meeting notes, right? We've journeyed through using computation to model life, the crucial role of embodiment, physical interaction in both tech and biology.
We've looked at the brain's incredible complexity, its structure, its function, those weird spiral waves.
Right. And we've explored that exciting, sometimes maybe unsettling frontier where AI is increasingly intersecting with biological insights, both drawing inspiration from it and being applied to it.
And we've seen researchers tackling questions from the really fundamental, like, what even is a memory enneagram?
All the way to the highly practical, like, how on earth do we make all this neuroscience data usable for everyone else?
Yeah. This deep dive, I think, really shows that the path forward, understanding ourselves better, building genuinely advanced AI, it involves looking in some maybe unexpected places.
Definitely. Drawing lessons from plants, maybe from video game physics, from the history of cybernetics, and thinking hard about the future of neurotechnology.
So here's maybe the final thought to leave you with, something really interesting to chew on.
Hmm.
Considering that scientists are still grappling with how to classify something as seemingly basic as different types of brain cells,
Yeah, that big open question.
and at the same time, even the creators of our most advanced AIs admit it's incredibly hard to truly understand what's going on inside them, despite efforts like Anthropic's.
Right, the interpretability
Yeah.
challenge.
How far are we really then from creating systems, biological simulators, or artificial minds that can genuinely map the mind? Map it in a way that's not just predictive, but comprehensive and crucially understandable to us.
That's a huge question. Are we just scratching the surface?
And maybe, what other biological systems out there, things we haven't even really considered from a computational perspective, might hold keys to completely new principles we haven't even imagined yet?
Yeah, what are we missing? Leaves you wondering.